God willing, we'll see him again. Listening to David's prayer, it's a miserable thought what the world would be without God's plans and what he prepared for mankind. It would be a black hole if there was not any good in the earth. And people who don't believe in God and don't serve God live without hope, and that's a miserable existence. So we're studying about the life of Christ, and I think it's always good to mention that Jesus was an eternal being in heaven with God before the foundation of the world, and all the purpose of God was brought together in Christ, and his plan for the salvation of man's soul was executed when Jesus came to the earth and took on the form of a man and lived this few years on earth and lived according to all the prophecies and promises that God had made and accomplished his part of salvation. And we need to always be mindful of the great love of the merciful God that we serve. We were talking on the class on Sunday and about the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, and I like to emphasize the timing of the life of Christ on earth, and the years of preparation, about 30 years that he spent as a baby in the youth, and then about 3.5 years during his ministry where he accomplished all those things for our salvation. And the life of Christ was framed by a slide I hope I can find. There it is. By 4 Passover feasts. And the Passover feasts of Jesus' ministry are mentioned in John 2:13, John 5:1, John 6:4, and John 11:55. The last year of Jesus' life was from around April at the Passover feast, just before the first retirement, mentioned in John 6 and verse 4, and then the annual feast that took place that year, the Feast of Pentecost, was 50 days after that, and then from June to October, the Feast of Booths and the Feast of Atonement take place in the Jewish month that corresponds to our October. And then there's a feast late in the year in December, the Feast of Dedication, and that was a feast added by mankind to celebrate the cleansing of the temple after the leftover people from the Seleucid Empire that corrupted the temple, and there was an emperor, king, whatever we want to call him, called Antiochus Epiphanes, and he sacrificed pigs on the altar in the temple of Jerusalem, and the Maccabean rebellion removed him, and they were able to cleanse the temple. I think the date is 164 BC, and so that is something that the Jews still recognize, but it was not part of the law at all. But that feast is mentioned in John chapter 10:22 as a feast that Jesus was at in Jerusalem. And so we know from the period of retirement that Jesus missed the Passover in April of his last year, and let me get on down a little bit here. Because as Jesus began his period of retirement, he was not in Jerusalem, he was in Galilee. So now. got in Galilee, and so he was not in Jerusalem or in Judea for the Passover feast that year. And so he and his apostles were in the areas that he spent time in during the retirement. And so the last year of his life was framed by the Passover feast, and then the next Passover and the next year, and at the next April, and the feast that he attended in John chapter 10 was the Feast of Dedication. And he was very active at that feast in Jerusalem. Look at our map here and review. Galilee is here, and which of these cities was the home base of Jesus shortly after he began his ministry? He moved up there, Charlie.
Capernaum.
Okay, Capernaum. And Capernaum and Bethsaida, Chorazin, the plain of Gennesaret, all this little area around the northern half of the Sea of Galilee, and Bethsaida over here. And we'll get into part of his movements was up in this area, Caesarea Philippi, in the north country, and Mount Hermon is the tall mountain up here. Part of the retirement period was spent over here in the area of Tyre and Sidon, and in the Phoenician plain along the upper coast of the Promised Land. This is Lebanon up in here in today's countries, and Syria is right over here. And to kind of get us on the daily news, and the nation of Israel barely covers this little piece of land right here. It's like 7.5 miles by 200 miles. The great empire of Solomon was from down here, the river of Egypt, all the way to the river Euphrates, and the heyday of the kings of Israel. Jesus, the farthest he got away from this area is when he was an infant, and they were guided into Egypt to flee Herod's attempts to murder him. And so from here to here, not very much territory, and he got over into the Decapolis and some right in here. In this last period of his last retirement, he avoided going into the territory that was controlled by the Herod descendants, which was on the west side of the River Jordan and over here. And when he came up into Phoenicia, the Phoenician plain, and Tyre and Sidon, he came down and around the north end of the Sea of Galilee and stayed in this territory over here that would have been out of the jurisdiction of those kings at that time. Let's see. So the period of the retirement, they spanned a period between the third Passover until Jesus is back in Jerusalem at the Feast of Tabernacles, which is mentioned, that's in the fall of the year. That's mentioned in John chapter 7, verse 2 and 10. And that being if the full Passover feast is correct. We talked about that a little bit. If that feast mentioned in John chapter 5 and verse 1 was another feast, then Jesus' ministry was only a little over 2 years and not 3.5. There's a lot of debate that's taken place over the centuries about that, and the majority opinion is that it was 3 years and some months.
Anybody have a question about that or comment? And, it's good for me when I'm trying to teach something to be organized in a place and time, and a place in history, and have a historical context, and a place in geography. And we wouldn't want to go on a vacation somewhere and not know the name of the place or some way to get there and leave. And that's the way I am about studying. Okay, the first retirement is mentioned in Luke 9. They were the apostles were coming back from the limited commission on which Jesus sent them. And who was the group that the Jews were sent to? That the apostles were sent to, Janet, on the limited commission?
The Jews.
Okay, and they were told not to go to the Samaritans, not to go to Samaria, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And they were given that mission. And when they came back, a lot of them were fired up because they had been given some powers that they had exercised, and they were ready to take on the whole world, they thought. But then when Jesus first retired, he went across the north end of the Sea of Galilee to Bethsaida, and when he got over there, he was going, oops, got to get the pointer separated from the other buttons here. He went over there to get some relief, and told his apostles they needed to get some rest. And the people's attitude, expressed in John 6:15, they were about to make him a king by force. They were going to stage a civil uprising and have a civil war and overthrow the Romans and the Jewish religious authorities, I presume, to make him king. And he had, by this time, worked enough miracles and healed enough people and raised some dead that he had proved himself the Messiah many times over. But there, the people on the mount didn't have any food, and Jesus fed 5,000 with some loaves and fishes, and I believe on this occasion there were, how many baskets left over, Farron? 12 baskets full of food. And so, a notable miracle. The people were happy about getting that food. And then Jesus dismissed himself to the mountain and began to pray. And the apostles were in a boat going over back across the few miles across the north end of the Sea of Galilee. And the weather was rough, and Jesus came walking to them on the water, and they were afraid about that. And then Peter asked him, "Is it you, Lord?" And said, "Well, let me come to you." And he made an attempt at walking on the water, and then began to sink. And Jesus got into the boat and saved Peter, and worked another miracle. When he got in the boat was instantly over to the plain of Gennesaret. Mark 6:53 and Matthew 14:34. Then the people were pressing him, and he went to Capernaum and was in the synagogue at Capernaum, and he had the long discourse in John 6 about his disciples that were following him having this attitude. They were liking it as long as they were getting groceries and getting the food. And then when he started talking in spiritual terms and saying, "You have to eat my body and drink my blood," and of course he didn't mean that literally, that he was trying to get people in a spiritual mode, and they were so locked into the physical mode and having a place to get something to eat. Remember when in Samaria, when Jesus was going on his second trip up to Galilee, David, he met a woman at the well, And what did he promise her?
Living water.
And what did she say? What was her response, Patty?
Like she wanted it.
Yes, she did. Give me some of this water so that we don't have to drop. Was her response. She wanted that water, and you know, I've in my lifetime I've drawn a bunch of buckets of water out of the well for my mother and grandmother, and you know, when I was a little boy, I thought that was a chore. And
It sounded like at that
but-
time she wanted, so
Some-
she just didn't have to do any more work.
Say that again,
I
Frank.
said, at that time, it sounded like she wanted it just so she wouldn't have to do any more work.
That's right, and there was a common well in most little settlements and little towns, and everybody didn't have a well at their home. And, you know, at least we had that in the poor South of the 1950s. But, you know, it's easy to say,
She was also thinking about physical water.
yes,
And
yes.
he was making reference to spiritual water.
Right, and so Jesus was on a different plane to others, to the human beings in this world he came in contact with. And so, verse 60 says, many therefore the disciples, when they heard this said, it's a difficult statement, who can listen to it? And it says, I like the New American Standard translation, Jesus conscious that his disciples grumbled. That's an interesting word. And he says to them, does this cause you to stumble? What then you should behold the Son of Man ascending where he was before? And it's the Spirit who gives life, the flesh profits nothing. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and their life. And so we have to be careful sometimes when we're reading the Bible. We can just cruise right through a verse in the Bible, and we might read it a few hundred times and pick up the book one day and then read it, and all of a sudden it dawned on us what the point was about some verse. And I've had that experience a lot. I hope that y'all have too, and that's not just singular for me. Charlie?
You know, when he back up, when they want to make him king, you know, they do it before. That's really what the Jews wanted, wasn't it? Somebody to come in, they've seen the power he has, what he done. That's what they want. And now he says, well, you got eating my flesh and drinking my blood. What's this got to do with you being king? You know, they missed it totally.
Yes, it didn't equate to a white horse and armies. And of course, the Jews knew their history of the great power of Solomon and his wisdom. You know, it was written down in their scriptures, and they could read about that. And I'm sure if I had been a Jew in that time, that would have been something we could be proud of. Now we've been in subjection to a bunch of different nations in a row, and now the Romans have got us, and they're not real keen people to work for. And you know, they might just get you off the street and take you away for a month or two and keep you in slave labor. And if you were lucky, they'd let you go and you get back home alive. And so
that desire to have an earthly king goes way back when God was your king, and they said, give us a king. We want to be like the nations around us. Give us a king.
yeah. And those are the descendants, nearer descendants of the people who saw the waters part on the Red Sea and the Egyptian armies get swallowed in there. They were way closer to those eyewitnesses of that than these people were from reading the books about it. You know, this is hundreds of years later, and it just it goes to show that people are hard to please.
Yeah, they still grumble.
Sir?
They still were grumbling.
Yes.
Just like the old ones were.
Murmured.
In the wilderness, yeah.
Then they murmured 3 days after they left
Egypt.
after they dedicated the temple and had the first Passover, the 3 days in the wilderness, said, we're starving to death. We want to go back.
Jesus got about a year left in his life.
Yes.
It seemed like it, you know,
Yeah.
he's saying it would not be aggravated that the apostles are not getting it. You know, they've been with him 2 years now. watched all he's done and his teachers, and they still can't get it.
That's right, and it's always, when I first understood what was being said in Acts, when they witnessed Jesus being taken up into heaven, that they asked him, now at this time, Lord, do you restore the kingdom to Israel? And they still didn't have that full grasp after spending all the time they did with you. These 12 people were in a tight group for a long time. You know, if I was together with that many of my relatives for that long a time, I'd be looking for a break, I think.
Period of retirement.
And you just think about Jesus and his intellect and his point in life and how they're missing this. The patience that it took for that is amazing. But after the first retirement, which lasted 2 days, it didn't really happen. Jesus got some time alone on the mount to pray, but he didn't get away from the crowds. And we'll notice a little bit more about that in Mark 7:1 and 7:5. These that probably should say John 7:5. It's not supposed to be Mark on both those. Anyhow, the Pharisees and scribes began to chide Jesus because they didn't follow the traditions. And what I wanted to notice about this, we went over this already in class, it's just, I use the word bluntly up there on the description of this. When they made that statement to him about his apostles not following the traditions, and he said, rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites. Now, if somebody comes up to you and say, you Carmelites, all y'all think is that everybody's going to be saved. If we said something this firm to them, we probably wouldn't get a second chance to say another sentence, would we? They wouldn't like it if we said, well, you Calvinists have been teaching this so long you don't know the truth, or something like that. You know, I think I would now say it a lot softer than this sounds. Rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, and he quotes the scripture to them and slaps them in the face with it. Then he says, in vain do they worship me, is the words of Isaiah, neglecting the commandment of God. You hold to the tradition of men. And then this, in the American Standard, once again, verse 9, he was also saying to them, you nicely set aside the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition.
It was a convenience school.
Yes. And one of them uses the word consent. One of the translations, this is the 77 version. I think the newest one uses the word consent. And so he could not say anything harder to them. You just are hypocrites. You set aside God's commandments, and you're supposed to take care of your father and mother, and you have this cross your fingers behind your back word to say, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or his mother, invalidating the word of God by your tradition which you've handed down, and you do many things such as that. He just blistered those folks. And these are not nice, gentle brethren of another Jewish young man that needs guidance. This is somebody that already planned to kill. Even the people in his home village wanted to kill him. And so this is seriously rebuking those folks. And they we begin to see more and more references to their plots to kill him and to their desire to kill him and get rid of him. And Jesus stayed in Galilee, missed that Passover, and he avoided that because he knew the end was quickly coming as it was, but it had to come according to the plan and timing of God. And then the second retirement, he went away in the area of Tyre and Sidon. And notice once again the end of that ellipse. Oh man. I don't know how I did that. What I'm trying to notice is at the end of that verse, he didn't want anybody to know where he was, but it says that he could not be hidden because there were people all the way in Tyre and Sidon that knew of him through word of mouth. They didn't have newspapers and Facebook, and so Jesus withdrew into those parts, and while he was there, he heals the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, and tells her that she tells him that she would like some scraps off the Jews' table, and he commends her and said, "Your daughter is well at home," and so that was the healing that took place there. And of course, anytime anything like that was done, it just drew more and more attention to him. And so he went along toward the Decapolis, which are the 10 cities across on the other side, starting about the northern third of the Sea of Galilee, going north and east, going south and east along the Sea of Galilee. And he was sitting on the mountain when he went down in that area, back toward, but he, as I mentioned earlier, went on the east side out of the territory of the Herods and came down again somewhere in the area of Bethsaida, Judas. And great multitudes came, bringing with those who were lame, crippled, blind, dumb, and many others, and they laid them down at his feet, and he healed them. So this retirement also has a lot of people trying to help him out to retire. And he goes on through the Decapolis, back across the Sea of Galilee to the west side, to Dalmanutha, in one verse, and I think Matthew calls it Magadan. It's about halfway down the Sea of Galilee on the west, and nobody knows what town or anything was there. There's no remnants there in that place. So he came through the Sea of Galilee and midst of the Decapolis, and then went across once again. Before he left, he went up into the mountain and waited, and the people came to him, and he fed 5,000 and healed a deaf man. And that evening, and then he left that area once again and made it back across to Dalmanutha. 4,000 were healed, not healed, but fed, similar to the 5,000 that we talked about earlier. There was some bread and fish, and on this occasion, I believe there was 7 baskets instead of 12 that were left over. And so, 4,000 people, he sent them away, and immediately entered the boat to go back across the sea. And this is the passage, Matthew 15:39. It's the same place that Dalmanutha is, and neither one of them get much print on the map books. And so he's back on the west side once again. And one thing that happened in that area, the Pharisees and Sadducees came up testing him, asking for a sign. And this is the first time that a combination of Pharisees and Sadducees had a confrontation with him. And Bob Walton's comment was that even people who hate each other can get together if they have a common enemy. And Jesus was a common enemy to both groups of those. The Pharisees for their traditionalism and the Sadducees for their liberalism. And he didn't give them a sign. He said, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and a sign would not be given it except the sign of Jonah. And he left them and went away. What's the sign of Jonah, Richard?
3 days.
The 3 days, and Jesus would be raised. And so he went again, left that area. He was probably somewhere near Capernaum again, and left that area and went back across to the other side, to Bethsaida. And this begins the fourth withdrawal.
Genius, he started to get harsher and harsher with his words. You know, his hypocrites full of gold, now it's you adulterous, naked.
He is. If you turn back and read right after he's baptized and he's talking to him, you know, John was immediately forceful with him. He could have said, "You're a generation of vipers. The axe is at the root of the tree." When they went to see him, and one group went to examine him to ask if he was the Messiah, and he said, "No, I'm not the Messiah, but I know who he is," and testified about Jesus. But the first times Jesus did miracles, and he said, "Well, you know, believe the works if you don't believe me." And so his answers were a lot less pointed at the beginning, but then the more pressure they began to put on him, and the firmer they were and the more hateful they were against him, he called them what they were. And at this time, he begins to tell the apostles that these people are going to take me and kill me, and then I'll be raised. And so that causes some confusion among the apostles. And so, and while he was there, beginning the fourth retirement, they came into the district of Caesarea Philippi. It's like 40 miles north of Bethsaida, Judas, near Mount Hermon at the northern end of the Promised Land. And he asked the disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And then, of course, in Matthew 16, Peter makes his great confession. But on the boat trip to Bethsaida, Jesus taught the 12 about the bread of life. And this is the occasion that he said, "Beware the leaven of the Pharisees." And they hadn't brought any food on the trip to the other side, and they said, "We got one loaf," and started talking about, you know, how to get food. And he had to remind them. He said, "Were you here? And how many baskets full were taken up after we fed the 5,000? They said 12. "How many baskets full after we just fed those 4,000 over?" They said 7. He said, "Don't you understand?" And then they understood that he was talking about the influence of the Pharisees, and he wasn't talking about bread. And so that was a lesson that he was able to teach them on the boat. And then when he was at Bethsaida, he healed a blind man. And then the rest of the retirement is north to Caesarea Philippi from the city of Bethsaida, Judas. And so when he came there, he was questioning the disciples. And I think because of Peter's confession, you know, "You're the Son of God." And Jesus said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because God has revealed that to you, not flesh and blood." They were beginning to get a grasp that this is really the Messiah. And and it wasn't just an infatuation with them. So Jesus went with his disciples and to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and they had these conversations, and a lot of people followed along on this retirement as well. And so Peter said, you're the Christ of God, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so Peter was given a distinction by the Lord on that occasion. He said, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And that didn't mean he was going to be the Pope. That meant he was going to preach the first gospel sermon, and he did on the day of Pentecost, 50 days after he was crucified. And so the apostles are beginning to get the idea. But then as he foretells of his death and resurrection, Peter dissembles. Shortly after this confession, days, after this confession, he says, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to be mistreated. I'm going to be taken to Jerusalem. They're going to kill me, and then I'm going to be raised from the dead. And what Peter heard was, they're going to kill me. Well, they understood that the Messiah was going to deliver Israel, and they still thought they was going to be delivered by somebody alive on a white horse, and how the Romans chased off, and they were thinking like that. And he said, no, not you, Lord. That's not going to happen. And the Lord said, get thee behind me, Satan. And so not more than a day or two is what I think. After Peter made that great confession, then he was trying to tell the Lord he didn't know what his mission was. He was, Peter had, in his history was being quick to speak, and sometimes he made some mistakes doing that, but Jesus, here you are, and you wanted the inner circle with the Lord, and just a little while, you're going to get chosen to go up on the mount where the Lord is transfigured with the patriarchs and identified by God himself. And so here you are getting rebuked in front of all your friends and disciples. And during this time, it's really interesting to notice there's an occasion that they're traveling, and a question comes up about which one of them is going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And so they're already trying to be lieutenant generals and commodores and admirals to the King of Kings. That's really interesting. I saw a show on the Catholic channel, and I do watch that occasionally if I see something that's a little interesting. And they were depicting this journey, and I think it used it might have been James and John who were depicted as the two arguing about who was going to be on the Lord's right hand, and that's how they put it in this. It was actors acting it out. They were walking along, and the group of them were walking along, and the Lord was walking up in front of them, and they started talking to each other, and kind of, kind of arguing. And I thought that was a really interesting portrayal of that. And you can, but the thought patterns, you're the Son of God. Am I going to be the adopted son of God and be a general in your army or something? It's hard to comprehend those thought patterns, and I'm not saying that any of us would do any better, but it's interesting to think about. And then during this period of time, it doesn't say that they ever left the area of Caesarea Philippi until it's about time for them to go to the feast of dedication in Jerusalem. And so this would be, getting on into, no, it's not right. The Feast of Tabernacle would be getting on into the fall, into, October, before they would, they left Caesarea Philippi and went back down to Bethsaida and then across to Capernaum once again, and then they went south through Samaria to Judea again, and that's when Jesus' brothers wanted him to expose himself and go to Judea and make a public appearance, so because they were demanding his appearance, and he said he was not going to go. And then they went, and he went and traveled through Samaria and came unannounced to the feast. And a lot of things took place there at the Feast of Tabernacle. The Feast of Booths is another term for that. Feast in October. And so at the Transfiguration, Peter, James, and John were taken up into the mount, and what I read is they were near Mount Hermon, the highest mountain there, and it doesn't name it. It says it went into a high mountain, so most people say it was probably that Mount Hermon. And so they witnessed the light, and Peter once again jumps up and let's build some altars for all of y'all, and that's God interrupts and says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him." And can you imagine what it sounded like? Much less when they, of course, they were blinded and hit the deck, and but human beings only rarely had that close a witness to the presence of God. And
We saw what the children thought of him when they were at Mount Sinai,
yes,
when he spoke.
yeah.
Don't let him speak to us.
Yeah, don't say anything else. We can't hear that. Anybody have any comments or questions? This is an interesting period of time. Sandra?
Yeah, I was just thinking when you said the Transfiguration, Moses kind of got to be in the land of Canaan.
He what now?
Moses kind of got to be in the land of Canaan
Yes.
in a spiritual sense.
Yes. And it was, Moses and David and the Lord's name appear most of any individual's name in the Bible. And somewhere somebody counted them and made a list of how many times the Lord was mentioned, how many times Moses was mentioned, and how many times David was mentioned. And it was a lot. Anybody else have a comment or a question? I think it's really interesting to pay attention to the apostles and how they acted, and we just have to realize that they weren't there yet with the knowledge they had, and it had to come fast after the Lord ascended back into heaven, and when the Holy Spirit came, they were able to speak with authority and with the gift of the Holy Spirit, and not get off into too far off. Peter, when he went to preach the household of Cornelius, said, I've never eaten anything common or unclean, when he was shown the stuff let down from heaven, and he had to be treated to a special vision for his mind to get around preaching to a Gentile. And so with his experience, still having feelings like that about the Gentiles, you can imagine what the publicans and the Pharisees You know, they were worried about getting touched on their cuff by somebody in the marketplace and being called unclean. Well, we got about 8 minutes left. I think we'll call it a class. Let me ring the bell. Appreciate your attention and help.